rolling plains of Western Russia would host the greatest clash of armor the world had ever seen. 2 million men, 6,000 tanks, and nearly 5,000 aircraft converged on a bulge in the front line, known as the Kursk salient. What began as Adolf Hitler's boldest gamble to reclaim initiative on the Eastern Front would end as a decisive Soviet triumph, and the moment Germany's war machine began its irreversible decline. By July, the Wehrmacht's dream of lightning victories had faded. The defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa had shaken German confidence, yet Hitler still sought a single blow to restore prestige and momentum. His generals promised that the new Tiger and Panther tanks, mechanical behemoths bristling with 88mm guns, could crush any Soviet defense. The plan was simple: strike both sides of the Kursk salient, encircle the Red Army's forces within, and destroy them. If successful, it would shorten the front by hundreds of kilometers and cripple Soviet morale before the Allies could open a second front in Europe. But across the steppe, Soviet intelligence had already uncovered every detail. Since the winter, Stalin's spies had fed Moscow precise reports of the German buildup. Tank numbers, unit positions, even the code name, Operation Citadel. Joseph Stalin, cautious after the disaster of 1941, allowed his generals to decide. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and his colleague Alexander Vasilevsky advised patience. Let the Germans attack first, they argued, bleed themselves white on defensive belts, and then counterattack with fresh reserves. It was a radical reversal of Soviet doctrine: not attack, but absorb and destroy. The scale of preparation was staggering. For months, hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers turned the Kursk salient into a fortress. Engineers dug 5,000 kilometers of trenches, laid nearly 500,000 mines, and emplaced thousands of anti-tank guns in concentric rings. Behind these lay multiple fallback lines, a depth of defense unlike anything seen before. Every field, every hedgerow was mapped for artillery support. Soviet troops rehearsed anti-tank tactics against mock German armor. By July, they were ready. Meanwhile, inside Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg, frustration mounted. Operation Citadel was delayed again and again, from May to June and finally to early July, as he waited for the new Panther tanks and Ferdinand tank destroyers to arrive. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to fortify. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the northern attack, warned of the risks, but Hitler pressed on. He believed German technology could overcome Soviet numbers. On July 4th, German artillery opened with probing bombardments along the front. The next morning, as the sun rose over the steppe, the full assault began. From Orel in the north and Belgorod in the south, twin spearheads of armor rolled forward under the Luftwaffe's protective canopy. More than 2,000 tanks surged into action, their engines churning dust clouds that stretched to the horizon. It was the largest armored assault ever attempted, a mechanical thunderstorm sweeping towards Soviet lines. Soviet observers reported the sound first, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar. Lieutenant Ivan Korchagin, manning an anti-tank gun near Ponyri, later described it. The earth trembled as if alive. We could not hear our own thoughts. Within hours, the German Ninth Army struck the northern defenses, battering through minefields and barbed wire under withering Soviet artillery. The Red Army's first defensive belt bent, but did not break. Soviet commanders refused to commit their reserves too early. They knew the deeper belts were designed to grind down the enemy. To the south, the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth made better progress. Supported by elite SS divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, German tanks clawed through successive lines, capturing several villages. Their goal? Prokhorovka, a railway town at the heart of the salient. There, they expected to break into open ground and complete the encirclement. But Soviet planners had anticipated every move. The Voronezh front, commanded by General Nikolai Vatutin, held back its armored reserves, nearly 1,000 tanks of the 5th Guards Tank Army under Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, waiting for the precise moment to strike back. The Germans advanced only 8 kilometers on the first day. Their vaunted new machines proved as fragile as they were powerful. Panthers overheated, tracks jammed with dust, and the Ferdinand tank destroyers, lacking machine guns, were helpless against infantry attacks. Every kilometer gained came at terrible cost. By July 8th, Hitler's staff realized that the offensive was already losing momentum. Luftwaffe reports showed unprecedented Soviet air resistance, new Yak and La-5 fighters challenging German control of the skies. For the first time, Soviet formations were coordinating tanks, infantry, and air support with deadly efficiency. In the north, Model's 9th Army stalled near Poniri, a small town that became the Verdun of Kursk. Street by street, bunker by bunker, German and Soviet troops fought with grenades and flamethrowers. The advance slowed to a crawl. Hitler's dream of a sweeping encirclement was collapsing into a brutal war of attrition. By July 10th, both sides were locked in a struggle of exhaustion. The Soviets had absorbed the main blow. Now the counterstroke was coming. At dawn on July 11th, the steppes south of Kursk erupted again. The German 4th Panzer Army renewed its push toward Prokhorovka, the key junction that anchored the Soviet defensive network. The air was heavy with smoke and the bitter stench of burned oil. Soviet artillery batteries, positioned on ridges overlooking the approaches, began a synchronized bombardment that shook the ground. The roar of engines answered back as the SS divisions regrouped, their Panthers and Tigers grinding forward in formation. General Hoth's men had clawed through 6 defensive belts in a week. Ahead lay one more, the last barrier before the Soviet armored reserve. Hitler himself was watching the reports from his headquarters, convinced that one final thrust could achieve victory. The SS Panzer Corps, led by the battle-hardened General Paul Hauser, prepared to break through at any cost. In the Soviet camp, tension was rising. General Vatutin and Rotmistrov, commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, knew the decisive moment had arrived. Their tanks, T-34s, KV-1s, and lighter T-70, waited camouflaged behind low ridges and tree lines. Crews sat by their vehicles, some writing short letters or sharpening bayonets, others staring silently at the horizon. They could hear the rumble of approaching armor long before it was visible. The plan was clear. Let the Germans advance to Prokhorovka's outskirts, then strike them head-on with overwhelming numbers. At 8:30 a.m. on July 12th, the 2 largest armored forces ever assembled collided on the open plains west of the town. Nearly 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns engaged in less than 20 square kilometers. The rising sun glinted off metal hulls and turrets as the fields filled with fire and dust. Accounts from both sides described the chaos as apocalyptic. Soviet tankers charged at full speed to close the distance. Knowing the long 88mm guns of the German Tigers were lethal at range, the clatter of treads and explosions merged into an unbroken roar. At times, tanks collided head-on, crews firing point-blank through open hatches. German Panthers, firing from ridgelines, tore through advancing waves, but Soviet numbers seemed endless. The air above became a separate battlefield. Over 1,000 aircraft, Stukas, Henschel ground attack planes, Yak fighters, and Il-2 Sturmovix clashed in swirling dogfights. Pilots described the sky as a burning sea of metal. Dust and smoke reduced visibility to mere meters. Communications failed. Orders were shouted, misheard, or lost in static. By noon, the entire front was a single maelstrom of exploding armor. For the Germans, the initial advantage of technology was offset by the sheer density of Soviet defenses. The Ferdinands, designed as long-range tank destroyers, became trapped in minefields and ambushed by infantry. Soviet engineers, carrying bundles of grenades, crawled beneath disabled tanks to finish them off. In one sector, Lieutenant Alexander Burda led his platoon of T-34s directly into an SS column, ramming enemy vehicles when ammunition ran out. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield around Prokhorovka had become a graveyard of machines. Flames rose hundreds of meters high. Burning fuel created black columns visible for miles. Soviet propaganda would later claim that 400 German tanks were destroyed in a single day. The real number was smaller, perhaps 70 to 100, but the psychological impact was devastating. The invincible aura of the Wehrmacht's armored divisions had been broken. Elsewhere along the front, the pattern repeated. North of Kursk, Model's 9th Army still battered itself against entrenched Soviet lines. Each hill and village changed hands multiple times, but German losses mounted. Supplies ran low, and the Luftwaffe, stretched thin by Allied bombing raids in the west, could no longer maintain air superiority. Soviet Yak and Lafiv fighters roamed the skies, hunting German bombers at will. On July 13th, news reached Hitler that would change everything. The Allies had landed in Sicily. Italy, Germany's most important partner in southern Europe, was now under direct attack. For Hitler, the prospect of losing the Mediterranean outweighed any potential gain at Kursk. Furious and shaken, he summoned his generals to his Wolf's Lair headquarters and abruptly ordered the offensive halted. Citadel, he admitted, has lost its meaning. But on the ground, neither side immediately knew it was over. The fighting continued for several more days as orders trickled down. German formations, now on the defensive, began to withdraw to prepared positions. Soviet commanders seized the opportunity. The long-awaited counter-offensive, Operation Kutuzov, began almost immediately, targeting the weakened Orel salient to the north. The Red Army's strategy had worked exactly as planned: absorb, exhaust, then strike. The Germans had committed their best divisions, nearly 70% of their armored reserves on the Eastern Front, and achieved nothing decisive. For the first time, the initiative on the ground passed permanently to the Soviets. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. Soviet losses were immense. More than 250,000 casualties and nearly as many tanks and aircraft as their opponents. The fields of Kursk were littered with wrecks. German Tigers and Soviet T-34s burned side by side, symbols of a battle where no side escaped unscathed. The aftermath of Prokhorovka would become legend. Soviet accounts portrayed it as a heroic triumph, the day when the Red Army shattered Hitler's final hope of victory. German officers writing later described it as the beginning of the end. The truth lay somewhere between. The Germans fought with skill and determination, but their ability to recover from losses was gone. The Soviet Union, drawing on its vast manpower and industrial capacity, could replace every tank destroyed, and then some. By mid-July, German commanders like Erich von Manstein and Walter Model were already repositioning their troops for defense. They understood that the Eastern Front had changed forever. From now on, the Wehrmacht would retreat, slowly, stubbornly, but relentlessly, all the way back to Berlin. The thunder of Kursk faded after July 16th, but its echoes would define the rest of the war. The Red Army, bloodied yet unbroken, prepared to advance toward the Dnieper and beyond. For the soldiers who survived, Kursk was not just a battle. It was the moment when they realized that the tide of history had turned. By the evening of July 12, 1943, the steppe was burning. Smoke rose from hundreds of shattered tanks, the air shimmering with heat and the smell of scorched fuel. The Battle of Kursk had reached its fever pitch. Every division, every regiment, every surviving vehicle was committed. In some sectors, front lines dissolved into chaos. Individual duels fought among fields of fire and wreckage. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Entire tank brigades were reduced to a handful of vehicles by sunset. Soviet engineers struggled to clear lanes through minefields, while artillery units fired non-stop for days without pause. Soldiers described the night sky as brighter than day, illuminated by tracers, burning fuel, and exploding shells. German commanders tried to salvage their offensive. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, leading Army Group South, urged Hitler to let him continue the attack, insisting that victory was within reach. But the truth on the ground told another story. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and relentless Soviet counterattacks had ground his divisions to exhaustion. Among those still fighting was the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division. Its commander, Theodor Wisch, later recalled the claustrophobic intensity of the engagement. "We no longer saw the battlefield as terrain. It was a sea of flame. Our tanks advanced by the light of burning machines. Crews often fought blind, relying on instinct and noise. The roar of engines, the shriek of ricochets, and the hammer of machine guns blended into one endless storm. At the same time, the Soviets were committing every reserve they had. General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was battered, losing hundreds of vehicles in just 48 hours, yet it continued to press forward. Rotmistrov, observing from a forward command post, radioed Stalin with a simple message: "The enemy is held. The line will not break." To ensure that promise, Stalin ordered the commitment of the steppe front, a vast second echelon under General Ivan Konev, held in reserve far behind the front. The moment of defense had ended. Now came the counterstrike. At dawn on July 13th, Soviet artillery began an unrelenting bombardment across a 300-kilometer front. Dozens of divisions advanced simultaneously, infantry, armor, and mechanized units rolling forward in waves. For the first time since 1941, the Red Army was launching a coordinated offensive on such a scale, and it did so with precision. North of Kursk, the Central Front struck first. The German 9th Army, already mauled at Ponyri and Olkovatka, found itself under attack from multiple directions. Soviet forces poured through breaches in the line, forcing the Germans to abandon their forward positions. Model's army, once among the most disciplined on the Eastern Front, was retreating. Meanwhile, in the south, the Voronezh Front and Steppe Front coordinated to trap the withdrawing German 4th Panzer Army. Soviet aviation dominated the skies. Il-2 Sturmovix strafed columns of retreating armor and transport vehicles, turning roads into charred trails of wreckage. German anti-aircraft gunners fought back desperately, but there were too few guns and too many Soviet planes. The fighting around Belgorod and Oboyan became a slaughterhouse. Villages changed hands 3 or 4 times in a single day. Soviet infantry advanced through smoke and dust, often at bayonet range. For the Germans, there was no longer a clear front line, only a series of desperate defensive pockets. The psychological toll was immense. For 2 years, German soldiers on the Eastern Front had believed themselves the masters of mobile warfare, the heirs to blitzkrieg. Kursk shattered that illusion. The Soviet army they faced in 1943 was not the same one they had crushed in 1941. It was disciplined, coordinated, and equipped with a new confidence that no longer feared the Wehrmacht's reputation. Hitler's decision to halt Operation Citadel on July 13th reached the front 2 days later. For those still fighting, it felt surreal. Thousands had died for a few kilometers of scorched earth, and now suddenly, the offensive was over. Commanders like Manstein fumed. They argued that with reinforcements, the German army might still turn the tide. But events elsewhere made continuation impossible. Allied landings in Sicily demanded immediate redeployment of Luftwaffe units and elite divisions. The German army could no longer fight a war on 2 fronts with full strength. As Soviet pressure mounted, German lines collapsed in several sectors. The Red Army advanced rapidly toward Orel in the north, encircling thousands of German troops. Operation Kutuzov, the counteroffensive designed to exploit Kursk's failure, gathered momentum. German strongpoints fell one by one. By July 16th, Soviet spearheads had retaken most of the ground lost during Citadel. The village of Poniri, once reduced to rubble, was back in Soviet hands. On July 18th, the Red Army liberated Belgorod, a key logistics hub, and within weeks, the front had shifted more than 100 kilometers westward. The climax of Kursk wasn't a single battle, but a chain reaction. The German army's offensive capacity breaking under its own weight. German logistics were collapsing. Panzer divisions, already short on spare parts, found themselves unable to repair or replace tanks. Aircraft losses, especially among experienced pilots, were irreplaceable. The Wehrmacht that had crossed into the Soviet Union with near-total air superiority 2 years earlier now fought under a hostile sky. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and radar-guided control networks turned the tables. The Red Air Force, once dismissed as clumsy and obsolete, was now the largest air fleet on Earth. In those weeks, the Eastern Front changed permanently. The Germans, who had advanced to within striking distance of Moscow in 1941 and Stalingrad in 1942, were now retreating from positions they could never regain. For the soldiers in the field, the signs were everywhere. In diaries recovered from German officers after the battle, a pattern emerges: weariness, disbelief, and resignation. One panzer commander wrote, "Our tigers burn like torches. There is no end to the Russians. Every man we kill, 2 more appear." On the Soviet side, morale soared despite staggering losses. Soldiers who had survived Stalingrad and Leningrad now spoke with certainty. "We will reach Berlin." For them, Kursk was more than a victory. It was redemption. The memory of 1941's humiliation had finally been avenged on the same fields where the German army once seemed unstoppable. By the end of July, the German High Command was forced to confront an undeniable truth. The Wehrmacht could no longer mount a large-scale offensive in the east. From now on, the war would be defensive, fought from one line of retreat to the next. The Battle of Kursk had lasted just over 6 weeks, yet its consequences would ripple for the rest of the war. The once mighty panzer divisions, the pride of Germany's military power, would never again recover their former strength. In Berlin, Goebbels' propaganda machine tried to spin the battle as a tactical withdrawal. But even loyal Germans saw the cracks. For the first time, civilians in occupied Europe heard whispers that the war was turning against them. As the Red Army advanced through the smoking ruins of the Kursk salient, Soviet cameramen filmed the wreckage, twisted metal, burned villages, the endless rows of graves. Those reels would later form the backbone of wartime newsreels shown across the Soviet Union. To the audience watching in Moscow, it was proof that the tide had turned. For the soldiers still trudging west, it was not victory that filled their thoughts, but exhaustion, and the knowledge that the road ahead, though finally moving toward Berlin, would be long and cruel. When the smoke cleared over the Kursk salient, what remained was a battlefield unlike any the world had seen before. The once green plains of Western Russia were scorched black, littered with burned armor and unburied dead. Soviet teams spent weeks collecting wreckage for scrap, dragging destroyed tanks by the hundreds to repair depots or smelters. Birds had fled. The air still carried the smell of cordite and oil. For the German High Command, the scale of the loss took days to register. Reports trickled in from the front, divisions reduced to a fraction of their strength, entire panzer regiments down to a handful of tanks. In total, Germany lost more than 500,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured across the Kursk operations and the Soviet counteroffensives that followed. The Soviets suffered even more, but the difference was crucial. The Red Army could replace its losses, while the Wehrmacht could not. The material toll was staggering. German industry, already strained by Allied bombing campaigns, could not match Soviet production. In the time it took to build one Tiger, Soviet factories produced 8 T-34s. At the height of Kursk, the Soviets fielded over 20,000 tanks across all fronts, a number Germany could never hope to equal. But the consequences extended beyond numbers. Kursk shattered the aura of German invincibility. For 2 years, German generals had dictated the tempo of war on the Eastern Front. Now, for the first time, they were reacting to Soviet moves. Hitler's obsession with offensive operations had drained his forces of strength and morale. The Führer's inner circle began to fracture. Field Marshal Manstein argued for flexible defense and counterattack. Hitler insisted on holding every meter of ground. Heated arguments in the Wolf's Lair became daily occurrences. "I will not retreat another step," Hitler declared, yet retreat became inevitable. By August, the Soviets had launched Operation Rumyantsev, a second offensive that captured Kharkov, a city Germany had taken and lost 3 times before. It would never return to German hands. The loss of Kharkov was symbolic, the end of the Wehrmacht's large-scale maneuver warfare in the east. From that point onward, German units would be forced into one defensive withdrawal after another. For the Red Army, Kursk marked the coming of age of Soviet operational art. The defensive in-depth system, the coordination of armor, artillery, and air power, and the disciplined command structure were all perfected here. The lessons learned at Kursk would shape every Soviet campaign that followed, from the Dnieper crossings to the battles of Belarus and Poland. On the ground, morale among Soviet troops surged. Correspondents wrote of villages cheering as tanks rolled past, of peasants offering bread and salt to soldiers who for the first time were liberating rather than retreating. "This time," one infantryman wrote in his diary, "we move west and we do not stop." German soldiers, meanwhile, felt the weight of inevitability. The letters sent home from the front changed in tone. Fewer mentions of victory, more talk of survival. Some officers privately admitted that the war was lost. One panzer lieutenant, captured near Belgorod, told his Soviet interrogator, "At Kursk, we realized we could no longer win, only delay defeat." The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German power, emerged from Kursk badly weakened. Hundreds of aircraft had been lost, many with their most experienced pilots. With the Allies bombing German cities daily, the Luftwaffe could no longer give the army full air support. The Red Air Force, now fielding thousands of fighters and ground attack planes, seized permanent control of the skies. Politically, Kursk strengthened Stalin's hand. His decision to delay and absorb the German attack had been vindicated. Western allies, still months away from landing in France, saw the Soviet Union as the primary engine of Nazi Germany's destruction. Diplomatically, Moscow's influence surged. At the Tehran conference later that year, Stalin would sit at the table as an equal among Roosevelt and Churchill, a position secured by victories like Kursk. Strategically, the battle also reshaped Allied planning. In London and Washington, the scale of Soviet success convinced planners that Germany was now on the defensive across the entire continent. It accelerated preparations for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, and shifted Allied air power toward the destruction of German industry. Yet for all its triumph, the Soviet victory at Kursk came at terrible human cost. Fields once filled with sunflowers were transformed into graveyards. Civilians returning to their villages found only ruins. Entire families had vanished, buried beneath the tide of battle. The Red Army's success had been bought with courage and blood on an unimaginable scale. For Germany, the psychological aftermath was equally severe. The generals who had once boasted of blitzkrieg now fought to justify retreat. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels worked tirelessly to disguise the defeat, claiming that the withdrawal was part of a larger strategic plan. Few believed it. Even among loyal Nazis, doubts began to spread. The myth of German military superiority, built at Sedan, at Kiev, and at Kharkov, was gone. The Reich would fight on for nearly 2 more years, but the momentum of war had irreversibly shifted. The initiative, once Germany's greatest weapon, now belonged entirely to the Soviet Union. In the weeks after Kursk, Hitler withdrew deeper into isolation. Reports from the front were filtered to protect him from bad news, yet his paranoia grew. He blamed his generals, his allies, even fate itself. "The East has swallowed us," he was heard to mutter. Meanwhile, on the steppe, life slowly returned. The sounds of war gave way to the hum of reconstruction. Bulldozers clearing wrecks, trains carrying supplies to the front, and farmers plowing soil still blackened by fire. Kursk became both a victory and a wound, a symbol of endurance written in steel and ash. By the end of 1943, Soviet forces stood on the banks of the Dnieper River, hundreds of kilometers west of where the battle had begun. The road to Berlin was still long, but it was now open, and nothing the Germans could do would close it again. In the decades that followed, the Battle of Kursk would come to symbolize more than a military victory. It represented a turning point in the very psychology of World War II. For Germany, it was the end of the dream of conquest. For the Soviet Union, it was the beginning of unstoppable momentum toward ultimate victory. When the Red Army raised its flag over Berlin in May 1945, many veterans traced that triumph back to the summer of 1943. Kursk had taught them that the Wehrmacht could bleed, that German armor could burn, and that discipline, planning, and sheer resilience could overcome even the most technologically advanced enemy. It was not a miracle of sudden victory. It was the triumph of preparation, over arrogance. In military history, Kursk marked the birth of modern defensive warfare. The Soviet doctrine of deep defense, multiple belts, redundancy, and mobile counterattack became the template for the remainder of the Eastern Front. Western analysts would later study it in detail, recognizing it as the forerunner of Cold War operational strategy. The battle demonstrated that numerical superiority combined with intelligence and logistics could neutralize even elite mechanized forces. For Germany, the legacy was grim. The defeat at Kursk shattered the Wehrmacht's ability to launch large-scale offensives. From that point forward, the German army fought a desperate retreat across the steppe, into Poland, and finally back to its own borders. The technological edge of its tanks and aircraft could no longer compensate for dwindling manpower, fuel shortages, and overwhelming Soviet strength. The loss also exposed deep flaws in Hitler's leadership. His obsession with prestige weapons, the Tiger, the Panther, the Ferdinand, had blinded him to practical realities. The German war machine was now producing fewer but more complex vehicles, while the Soviets focused on reliability and mass production. In the end, simplicity won. Among historians, the numbers remain staggering. Around 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns took part in the campaign. Nearly 2 million soldiers fought on both sides. Casualties exceeded 800,000. No single engagement in history would see such concentrated armored combat again. Yet beyond the figures lies something deeper, a shift in the human spirit of the war. Kursk showed that the Red Army, once derided and humiliated, had matured into a professional and determined force. Soviet soldiers no longer fought with desperation alone. They fought with conviction that they could win. That belief spread from the front to the factories, to the families rebuilding shattered towns, and to the halls of power in Moscow. In the West, Allied commanders followed the reports with growing admiration. The success of the Soviet counteroffensive reassured them that the Eastern Front would hold firm, buying time to prepare for the invasion of France. When D-Day finally came a year later, much of Germany's strength was already locked in an unwinnable struggle against the Red Army, a struggle that had truly begun to unravel at Kursk. The battlefield itself became a national shrine. After the war, the region was rebuilt, and the wrecks of tanks and guns were collected to form memorials. Soviet children visited them on school trips, hearing stories of courage under fire. Veterans returned every July, standing silently beside the rusting hulks where so many of their comrades had fallen. Monuments rose across the former front line, granite obelisks marking places like Prokhorovka, Ponyri, and Belgorod. The inscriptions were simple. Here, the enemy was stopped. For the Germans who survived, memories of Kursk carried bitterness. Many officers would later write that the battle had been doomed before it began, delayed too long, misjudged too deeply, and launched against an enemy far stronger than they believed. One veteran reflected, "We fought against the Russians, but it was the land itself that defeated us. It swallowed us whole." Even today, the echoes of that summer remain. Satellite photos of the region still reveal faint scars of trenches and shell craters. Farmers occasionally unearth fragments of armor or bones, reminders of the vast struggle that unfolded across those fields. Kursk's legacy endures in every military academy's curriculum, every textbook describing the turning points of the Second World War. It stands alongside Stalingrad and Normandy as one of the decisive confrontations that determined the fate of Europe. But unlike those battles, Kursk was not about cities or ports. It was about sheer willpower, fought on open ground, where no side could hide. In the end, it was the Red Army's patience, intelligence, and sacrifice that decided the outcome. By choosing to endure the first blow rather than deliver it, the Soviets allowed the Germans to break themselves against an unyielding wall of steel. The result was not merely victory, it was transformation. The Battle of Kursk remains a testament to the turning tide of the 20th century. It proved that industrial power, discipline, and endurance could defeat aggression and arrogance. It marked the moment when Nazi Germany's war machine began its long, unstoppable collapse, and when the Soviet Union, bloodied, scarred, but unbroken, became the decisive force that would end the war in Europe. As one Soviet veteran later said, "Standing before a monument of twisted metal, we did not win in a day. We won by not giving up." Kursk was not the end of the war, but it was the end of their victory.